Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013. Can I remind all those present that electronic devices, particularly mobile phones, but all electronic devices should be switched off at all times while the committee is in session. Our first item today is to continue evidence taking on the Children and Young People Scotland Bill. The first panel will focus on the issue of early learning and childcare, and can I welcome to the committee Councillor Douglas Chapman and Robert Nicholl, who are representing COSLA. Joan Martlew, Course Director of the BA in Childhood Practice at the University of Strathclyde, and Purnima Tanuku, Chief Executive of the National Day Nurseries Association Scotland. Good morning to you all. We've got a lot of to cover this morning in our agenda, so I want to move straight to questions, and I'm going to begin the questioning this morning with George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Basically, I'll just go straight into the question right away. I'll ask what effect the change from 475 hours to 600 will make on child development. And who wishes to go first? I'll ask Douglas first.
Thanks very much for the starter for 10. I think it's widely recognised that the investment that Scotland is making in early years is really important in terms of all the evidence that's been produced to date. It's in line with all of the discussions we've had regarding the Christie Commission and so on in terms of preventive spend, and I think that's the main reason that we should be pursuing a greater number of hours at the very earliest years. As the committee knows, the funding covers 3 to 4 year olds and vulnerable 2-year-olds as well, and again it's while I'm sure there's many who would like to see that extended further, I think it's a very much a step in the right direction, and I think it's a welcome step, and it's something that we would happily support within the bill.
Do any other members have a view?
Purnima Tanuku from National Day Nurseries Association in Scotland. We absolutely fully support the move from the Scottish Government, but I think how the funding is going to be passed on to the actual frontline providers needs to be very carefully looked at, because at the moment the private voluntary independent day nurseries actually care for 60,000 children, approximately half of the children taking up nursery places so in the independent private and voluntary sector. And in fact this increases to 40,000 under 3s in care in early learning in private and voluntary day nurseries. And at the moment, on the funding that they receive from the local authorities, they're actually making losses of about £550 per child per year. In terms of the cost implications. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at when the extension takes place in terms of 600 hours.
Joan Martlew from the University of Strathclyde. Again, I welcome the addition of the additional hours. The 600 hours is important because if we're looking at child development, additional time spent in an early years high quality environment will only enhance children's social, emotional, cognitive and all-round development. My concern is where the 600 hours is going to come from. Is it going to be an add-on? And my other concern is how the local authorities are going to manage this if there's no direct guidance from the Scottish Government.
Could you possibly give us some guidance on some of these questions that were brought up there?
Well, I'll bring in Robert as well, but in terms of the flexibility, again, members will know, looking at the bill, that there's flexibility built into the bill in terms of the funding stream that will come through over the period up to 2020. And I know that ADES, the Associate Directors of Education, are already working up different models of delivery, and that will, as the funding streams come through, then obviously it allows local authorities to develop more flexible models that will be in the interest of parents and obviously in the interest of children. I think to take the point as well, I think it's very important that we focus on high quality education and care and make that the real focus for this. Hopefully over that period of time we'll see significant improvements in the development of young people and young children in our community. But I know Robert had other I mean, if I could maybe take the last couple of points about where the 600 hours come from and the management issue. I mean, we have to understand that we're not coming from a sort of blank sheet of paper here. Local authorities have been delivering early education and childcare for many years. So we're looking to build on what's already been well established within Scotland. As Douglas was saying, there's an element of flexibility built within the proposal. So we're not looking for any one particular model to be delivered. We're looking for the adaptation of what works to local areas. So there will have to be an element of flexibility for delivery. There was the issue about management and guidance, and obviously we are working very closely with government. Indeed, we're working with them on what will become the statutory guidance for the Act. But obviously, the Act has to be written first. So, you know, what will form the guidance will be developed based on the discussions in this committee and in Parliament, and will obviously inform what councils will do. But the element of flexibility is important, not just for authorities, but for parents and families too.
Just ask, Joan mentioned the high quality environment that you were hoping for. Do you think the employment of a teacher or a childhood practitioner makes a difference to this quality of environment?
Any reports that have happened in the past couple of years with HMIE have indicated that there is a difference where there's high quality staff training. Research has indicated, the EPI research has also indicated that where the lead professional is educated to degree level, the children have a higher quality and better learning environment. So definitely.
Can I just interrupt you there for a second? You mentioned the EPI study. I mean, isn't it the case that the EPI study did not compare teachers and childhood practitioners?
They looked at employees who had a degree qualification, not just teachers.
I mean, they did not make a direct comparison between teachers and childhood
No,
practitioners.
it didn't.
No, so I think we just have to be clear about exactly what was compared in the EPI study.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Claire Adamson.
Yeah, I wondered if I could ask Joan if you could expand on what you mean by just an add-on and maybe give us what your ideal would be.
I think my concern is that if it's so flexible, children could actually attend an early years establishment for education purposes 7.5 hours over 2 days, and that would be their 15 hours. And I would have great concerns if that was the case, if there was that degree of flexibility. Children would have difficulties in settling. The continuity of their educational experience could be delivered in a patchwork manner, and I do have concerns. My other concern is that if it's an extra half hour added on to the 2.5 hours that children receive when they go to mainstream nursery school, the implications for staff planning and staff training it would also concern me, because at the moment the 2.5 hours per child per day allows staff to undertake planning and additional training. If they lost an hour a day from delivering another half hour per child, I do have concerns about that, because it's of vital importance that these early years professionals do have planning time.
I think one of the major concerns in the bill, from our point of view, is the lack of parental choice. And at the moment, it's actually not covered in the bill. Local authorities decide on which settings get funded. And as a result, what happens is a parent will take a child, not of their choice setting, but actually the local authority's choice setting, which is actually funded. And as a result of that, they're having to take the child there first and then take to an aftercare setting or another nursery to actually be looked after by after. So sometimes if the parent is actually wants to take a child nearer to their workplace, they don't have that choice. And I think we operate across the 3 nations, and I think that is the biggest difference in the bill, which is actually not covered. And we really feel that actually the funding should follow the child, and parents should have a choice, provided the settings, whether it's private, voluntary, independent, whatever, they have the standards are met by them and quality is high. I think parents should have that choice. Unfortunately, that is not actually covered in the bill.
Can I ask you to comment on some of these points?
It's certainly that's something that I don't think we've really looked at in any great detail, because it is not part of the proposal that's before us. But when local authorities do work already with partner providers, whether that be in the private sector or in the third sector, there's a huge amount of early years work that goes on within local authorities themselves. And you know, our view is that the system we have at the moment allows quite intricate planning to take place in terms of the places that are available to children and to parents. And you know, for money to follow a child, for example, I think that starts to remove away and eat away at the planning aspect, the proper planning aspect of the early years provision across the board. And that's certainly been our view, and it's the view of local authorities across Scotland. And again, I know Robert has been in close contact with local authorities on this.
Just to back that up, I think our issue, and I think it touches on both what the two panellists saying the important thing is quality. Quality is the absolute thing that we are wanting to deliver. So there's no expectation on our part that the flexibility or the options that are delivered are pursued to such an extent that it starts to erode the quality of the service that parents and families get. If you speak to any educationalists, as I have, in the development of the bill, they would share the concern that options are pursued that would effectively, deliver a poorer quality service. So that's the absolute bottom line for local government. I think on the issue about money following the child, as Douglas was saying, there's an element of planning that has to go into all education delivery. It is a 3 to 18 curriculum after all. Now, it's important that we are able to, local government is able to look at the best way of delivering within a local area, because that has to vary depending on the partner providers that are present, and depending on the geographical makeup of an area, that can vary. So it's important that planning is able to be taking place to ensure that it's not just about quality but improvement as well. Registration is important, but ongoing planning and development, staff development, improvement is all part of education delivery, whether that's in preschool or primary school or indeed secondary school.
Just before I bring in Joan McAlpine, can I clarify something with yourself, Joan? You mentioned earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said that you were opposed to, or you didn't support the idea of extra hours being split over 2 days, for example. I think you said it'd be disruptive to...
What my...
So I can finish this point. Now, we had parents here last week who said that's exactly what they wanted, because they wanted the ability to get a job part-time, for example, and you could get a job 2 days a week, but it was almost impossible to get a job that was like an hour and a half a day. So
I think that my concern is that if children are only attending nursery for 2 full days, they would be putting in a longer day than their counterparts in primary school and in secondary school in an educational establishment, and they would also not have access to that provision for another 5 days. So that would be my concern. I can understand that parents would like flexibility, but if you're putting the child at the centre of their learning, to attend only for 2 full days, I think would be detrimental to their development.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to return to the point that the convener made earlier about childhood practitioners and teachers. It was certainly my understanding in the past that outcomes for children were far higher if they had access to a teacher. But I understand that with courses such as your own degree course, that's changed now. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how childhood practitioners, what they can bring that perhaps teachers don't bring?
Childhood practitioners, when they come to do the BA childhood practice, they must have their initial childcare qualification, whether it be an HNC childcare and education or an SVQ3. They also must have 2 years work experience, post-qualifying experience working with children under the age of 5. Teachers, on the other hand, do not have to have that. Teachers in their training only have 4 weeks practical student experience in a nursery. So teachers who exit with a BEd may only ever have worked as a student with children under the age of 5. BACP practitioners have their initial qualification and they attend university to undertake a degree which provides a more critical analysis, or provides them with the opportunity to be more critically analytical of what they're doing and to investigate a wide range of different topics, such as your psychological approaches to working with children. Most of the outcomes are related to their workplace practice, so they have to reflect on the theory and then demonstrate that they have an ability to actually apply that within their workplace practice.
Thanks very much. So it seems to me from what you're saying that if a child is being educated at nursery stage by people with a degree in childhood practice, that this obligation for them to have access to a teacher perhaps isn't as important as it's been in the past.
I don't think it is as important, particularly, as I mentioned before, that not all teachers who are placed in nursery actually do have experience of working in a nursery situation. Childhood practice practitioners do, they must have before they're able to come into onto the course. One recent addition we've made within Strathclyde to the BA Childhood Practice is we've revalidated the degree and we've now included the addition of an optional honours year, which means that students can exit at the same level of qualification as teachers can as well.
Is there a difference between what we're providing in Scotland in terms of these kind of courses and in England?
Do you want to?
If I could just come in, please. Highly skilled, qualified workforce are absolutely crucial to the child development. But what is important is not just graduates and teachers, but teachers and graduates with early years experience. Now, in the sector, there are about 98% of early years workforce are female. And there are people who are actually mature people who may not have those qualifications, but they're absolutely wonderful at caring for young children. I think what we need to look at is the balance of having highly skilled, qualified workforce at the same time as mature people. If a parent goes into a nursery, what they're looking for, not 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds fully staffed in the nursery, but actually they're looking for a balance of experienced practitioners as well as mature workforce. And I think there needs to be some recognition for that, and also there needs to be some support for the workforce, because at the moment with the local authority cuts, the availability of training from a local authority point of view for providers is actually cut at a local level, and I think that's where the investment needs to be happening. And answer to your question in terms of the difference between England, Wales and Scotland, definitely there is a difference, because the government in England are moving towards actually introducing early years teachers and early years educators, which are slightly different levels of practitioners, and they already have early years practitioners who are actually working in early years settings. But I think the key is people with early years experience, not just teachers per se.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to look specifically at resources here. Part 6 is probably the most expensive part of the bill, costing around £100 million. Comments been made on the increase in qualifications and so on for nursery staff, and comments also been made about the wages of nursery staff. Given that all these qualifications have increased, and presumably that's created different hierarchies and so on within the nurseries, how has that affected the wage structures within a nursery?
It's certainly affected the wage structure, because if you look at the cost of childcare, it's increasing all the time, and you've seen the statistics in terms of the annual survey. But what makes up that cost is, certainly for private voluntary providers, the rates, the rent, the utilities bills, and everything else. That is actually 80% of the cost in a nursery is actually workforce staffing costs. In Scotland, we've seen business rates increasing between 100 to 150%, the highest across UK, which has actually become the second most biggest cost for day nurseries. And all that impacts on the parental fees and, of course, the salaries that they pay for staff as well. And I think this is where, when we conducted our recent survey, the funding that's allocated across different local authorities is very different. And I think it's absolutely laudable that the Scottish Government is investing a huge amount of money. But what is important is to make sure that money is actually spent on early years provision for childcare at the front line. And I think that's the biggest challenge for day nurseries. A lot of day nurseries are struggling. Sustainability is a big issue. The occupancy is only between 70% to 80%, depending on where they're located. Particularly in the rural areas like Highlands, actually, they're very isolated and parents need to have that choice. But unfortunately, they're not able to set up there because it's not a sustainable business.
Comment was made earlier on about nurseries being underfunded to an average of £550 per child. Can you explain a little bit more about how that figure is made up?
Yes. Basically, there is a cost for per hour, per child. Sometimes nurseries offer very good flexibility, half-a-day sessions, full-day sessions, and they have a cost that they need to recover. And that cost is based on all the other costs that they'll have to actually pay, including the staff wages and all these things. And the rate, what they charge parents, and the rate, what they are actually getting from the funded hours, there's a big difference. At the moment, I think, you know, the Finance Committee are looking at this tomorrow. The assumptions are made that if they are funded to £4.02 an hour, when the advisory floor targets were introduced in 2007, actually, since then, the funding hasn't kept up with inflation. People are getting still the same level of funding. I think on average it works out around £3.40 to £3.50 across the country, and there's no way that is actually adding up in terms of cost of childcare. So what nurseries end up doing is actually subsidising that with the other parents who are actually using the nurseries more than the funded hours or full-time. And there is no such thing as a full-time daycare anymore because parental choice is very different now. A lot of children are being cared for by friends and relatives and grandparents because of the cost of childcare. And I think this is the big conundrum. And I think there needs to be some very clear guidance to local authorities. I agree with our COSLA colleagues in terms of flexibility. But there is capacity in the PVI sector. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Where there is capacity, I think we should use it. Lots of local authorities work very well with the PVI providers, I agree with you, but unfortunately there are still some local authorities, when they see the private sector with a big P, even though they are very small community-based nurseries, that stigma is still there in terms of some local authorities.
Mention was made of the advisory floor. What would the resource implications be if this was reinstated?
I mean, I think when it was introduced in 2007, the assumption was made that actually, if we put a minimum level of funding, all local authorities would hopefully actually give a little bit more than that, or actually pay for the real cost. It didn't happen. But I think what is important is that actually, we would strongly advise to actually introduce that kind of level, because across the different local authorities, the rate they pay is very different. I mean, £3.40 per hour, people pay a lot more than that for babysitters.
You must have some sort of a figure that would be reasonable as the floor.
I think that needs to be really worked up across the board in terms of what the actual cost of childcare is, and we're very happy to be part of that dialogue in terms of looking at it.
Just to round up, what would the implications be cash-wise if you use childhood practitioners rather than teachers? What would the implications be cash-wise?
They're cash-wise, a childhood practitioner with in a lead practitioner role may earn up to £25,000. Teachers with years of experience may earn up to £30,000. So there may be some cash saving at the current rates. Again, I would really need to look at sort of more detailed figures to be able to provide that, and I don't know whether you would have any information about that.
Do you have any view on the views that have been expressed by Purnima? Do you have anything to add or agree or disagree with?
Yeah, I mean, just on the advisory floor, obviously, it's been something that we have discussed within COSLA as well, and as the bill is currently framed, you know, there wouldn't be any resource available to adjust that. From, you know, I think each local authority comes to its own agreement with its partner providers at the moment, and that's something that we would endorse remains in place, other than additional funding or resources being made available to cover the additional costs that would incur.
There was a letter issued by the Minister to the convener of the Finance Committee on the 12th of September, saying that the financial memorandum includes an estimate of 1.2 million for uprating partner provider payments in line with inflation from 2007, etc., etc. We now think the figure should be in the region of £2 million. So it sounds like, we've only just received this morning, but it sounds like there is a recognition and an increase in the amount of money that would be available for partner provided payments.
No, Robert's been in close discussion with civil servants on the bill.
Yep. I mean, we're aware about the increase as you're outlining. I think the important point to make is that there's money within the costings for the bill for a variety of things, including staffing costs. However, delivery costs are always going to be slightly different, and it's important that whatever that councils have the flexibility to be able to judge for themselves with their partner providers what it is a fair settlement in terms of investment and funding locally. So you're right, there is money within how they've costed the proposals within the bill, but that as we've highlighted in our submission, the actual cash that local government will get in future years isn't always able to be determined. So it's important that at the time of delivery, authorities are able to decide, weighing up all the options and all the issues that they have, what it is that's actually affordable to invest.
Thank you very much. Jane Baxter.
Morning. I was going to ask about flexibility and parental choice, but we've already talked quite a lot about that. But just for the purposes of the record, I'm going to ask my questions anyway. If you feel you've given sufficient answer, then don't feel obliged to say more. So, Section 48 of the Bill requires that local authorities must have regard to the desirability of ensuring that the method by which it makes early learning and childcare available in pursuance of this part is flexible enough to allow parents an appropriate degree of choice when deciding how to access the service. And COSLA have said that there's timescale implications there and resource implications, but they feel that they can take a reasonable approach to that. So I'm wondering, given what we heard last week from parents about the importance of flexibility, how quickly do you think local authorities can move towards implementing this?
Again, it's resource based, and you know, I think even in your own constituency, in Scotland Fife, you know, you've got areas that are you know, hugely rural. You've got main centres where the delivery of early years education will be totally different, and I think it's that level of flexibility that we actually need to think through, and I think within local authorities they have the professional expertise to make sure that the service is provided as flexibly as we can. I think in year one, talking about August 2014, then you know, I think for most local authorities that will mean that the number of hours will be increased from 475 to 600. And I'm not sure how much flexibility will be available within that first year. But as you can see from the resource flow, that as more resources come in, that allows us to make other changes to the delivery that's available to parents. And hopefully that's a discussion that we can have, or each local authority can have with their own parents, to make sure that it's trying to meet the need that's there. Again, I'm not sure at the end of the 5 or 6 years we'll be able to satisfy absolutely everyone. You never can. But at the same time, again, as I said earlier, it is a step in the right direction. And while there might be people who want to take another step, you know, that's very much in the future.
I think flexibility and parental choice very closely linked together, and COSLA's submission, absolutely agree. Increased flexibility is actually more complex and actually costs more money as a result. But the PVI sector have already been delivering that flexibility for a number of years. But what the bill wouldn't actually allow is introduce a right to parent to use a particular provider. I think that is the big difference, because actually, if I'm a parent, if I'm working across the borders of two local authorities, there are already issues in terms of how the child is funded. Now, let alone the borders of other countries, England and Scotland, because there are providers who operate across those borders. So there are big issues in terms of cross-border funding for children. And parents are having to actually take the child, not necessarily to the provider of their choice because where they live or where they work, but because of the choice that the local authority have decided on using a certain provider. So that's where the biggest problem is. So flexibility is very much interlinked with the parental choice.
I think lots of local authorities are already moving towards more flexibility with the closure of lots of nursery schools and the expansion of family and day centres where there are extended hours and not restricted to term time. And I think that would be something that certainly would help with the flexibility and the rights of parents as well as the rights and the needs of the child.
Yeah, there was another point. Robert,
Yeah, I was just really going to come on that last point. Actually, I think what would be interesting for the committee to know is that certainly from our experience, authorities are thinking ahead as to what it would mean to deliver flexibility in those future years. As Douglas was saying, the very first year probably will be about 600 hours and with no additional flexibility on that. But as we move on, they are, they're looking to think now as to what that would mean, and if they can move quicker than perhaps is set out in the bill. Obviously, they will want to do that, but that will be a local choice, and that will depend within the resources they have available. I think the important point to get across is that authorities will hopefully be funded for the money that's within the financial memorandum, and we'll have to work within that. There isn't more money than is possible to deliver it, in which case we'll just have to deliver what's possible, if that makes sense.
Resources allowed, do you think that parents should be able to choose which days and which nursery their child attends for the 600 hours?
I don't think it's a question, about if resources are allowed, because it happens in other countries. Actually, every parent is different, every child is different, their circumstances are different, the working patterns are different. So parents should have a choice, provided that provider delivers high quality. And I think from a resource point of view, it doesn't matter which setting the child goes to, as long as that setting, whether it's a maintained nursery or a private voluntary day nursery, is funded accordingly to deliver that high quality. Because at the end of the day, what is important for children is the best outcomes for all children.
Yes, I agree with that. I think the flexibility is of crucial importance. Parents should have the right to choose, but I don't think we should lose sight of what is best for the child.
No, I don't think I have anything to add.
The only thing I would add to that is we have to be careful in advocating a position like that. We don't end up undermining the position that we've already established within Scotland through high authority early learning and childcare. The quality element is obviously the number one thing from a local authority point of view. Yes, choice for parents is absolutely something we would want, but not if it comes at the expense of quality. And the importance of being able to plan across an entire area, because I think what is being advocated is akin to a market delivered solution, and as we've seen with other market delivering solutions, that's not always a thing that works out in the long run. It would have to be very carefully considered that it doesn't undermine the success we've already been delivering.
That's okay, thank
Can
you.
I just sort of take up where Robert's left off, Purnima? Isn't there a danger of sort of the law of unintended consequences kicking in here? I mean, clearly there are areas that are very, very popular for parents, and there are areas which are less popular. For example, many primary schools have nurseries attached, and children go to that nursery and then move on to the primary school and then the secondary school. I live in such an area which is very popular. There's huge demand. There's demand from parents out with that area who don't live in the council area to try and get their children into the nursery school in order to then move on to the primary school, etc. And so to be in that particular education system. How do you deal with those pressures if you go down the kind of market-driven solution that Robert mentioned, and deal with that kind of difficulty when the local authority has to manage the level of demand with the level of supply in its area?
I think what's important is to look at the mixed economy in Scotland, which exists already. Like I said, more than 40,000 children under twos, 60,000 under twos, and 40,000 3- and 4-year-olds are being looked after in the PVI sector. In terms of the unintended consequences, what we've got to be careful about is that we've given some case studies in this submission that we do not reinvent the wheel. Where there is high quality provision, we should be able to use that provision. What we must be very careful about is in some local authority cases, actually they are being told, the providers are being told, thank you very much, we don't need you anymore because actually we're going to be setting up a nursery within the school or within the local authority catchment area. And that actually threatens the sustainability of that high quality provision already exists. So I think when we're actually looking at a limited amount of resources, what we must make sure is actually how do we spend those resources? Where is the existing provision? I'm sure there must be gaps. There will be gaps in some areas. There is over provision in some areas. There is under provision in some areas. That mapping needs to be done very, very carefully. Just to give you an example from England, when the Children's Centres agenda first started about 4 years ago, a huge amount of money was spent building brand new children's centres. A lot of capital funding was spent on right next door to the existing high quality provision. And what happened to those now, I'm sure the panel are very much aware of that. There is actually very little, less than 2% of childcare is now delivered through those children's centres. And I think that is a lesson that I think is important to learn, that actually not duplicating provision, but making sure existing provision is utilised, provided it's high quality and meets with all the standards.
Joan McAlpine.
If I could go back to some of the differences in England, which have already been brought up. It's been suggested by the Family and Childcare Trust that there's a lot of nurseries closing in England and that the targets that the UK government has set for educating children and 2-year-olds in particular may not be met because of the nursery closures.
Absolutely. Sustainability is a big issue across England, Scotland and Wales, and for the reasons I've highlighted earlier on. Same, absolutely, story in England in terms of the hourly rate that the nurseries are paid in some areas. That's why recently the Minister actually introduced a minimum level of funding for the 2-year-olds, and that's something that we were actually quite closely monitoring. But there is a huge capacity issue for 2-year-olds. In some local authority areas, they're able to meet the targets. In other local authority areas, they're not able to meet the targets. So I think that's really important when the 600 hours extension takes place. It's properly financed and properly calculated, and the mapping exercise needs to be done in terms of where the gaps of provision are. I'm sure local authorities are already doing this work, but what is important is they need to work together in strong partnership with the PVR providers across the country.
And you're quoted in Children and Young People Now today as saying that proposals for 1-year-olds to get 10 free hours of childcare a week are unsustainable. Absolutely.
Because Lib Dems have just announced that that is their aspiration moving forward into the next general election. But what is important is if the current extension is not funded properly, what we're actually going to do is actually increase that problem. I mean, the figure that we have actually estimated in Scotland for the extension, if that level of funding doesn't improve, is going to be increasing from £500 loss to £750 loss per child per year. And I think, we need to look at, for the last 4 years, why the rates haven't actually even kept up with inflation, never mind about increasing.
Also going back to England and Wales, the Child Poverty Action Group and Barnardo's have both criticised some of the UK government's initiatives in terms of income tax breaks funding childcare as being biased in favour of the wealthier families and that poorer families are missing out. Would anyone care to comment on that?
I think from our point of view, we're more interested in what happens in Scotland, and we're especially interested in making sure that the bill is funded, and as we have got agreement from government for that. I think it's dangerous to make too many comparisons with the rest of the UK. Scotland does have a different education system, and rightly so, and we do things because we think they are the best things for Scotland, and that breaks down to the local level too. I agree with the panellists in terms of planning matters. We don't want to create a great number of white elephants. It's important that planning goes in the local level to ensure that the mixed market which COSLA supports is able to be best utilised, and that's important. And we would argue local authorities are best placed in order to do just that.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. Can I assure Mr Nicholl and the rest of the panel that the majority of the committee is interested in the aspects of this bill rather than necessarily spurious comparisons with other parts of the country? I think we've touched earlier on in the evidence, and it certainly came up in the evidence last week, about the benefits of some exposure to nursery and early education amongst in the pre-3-year-old age group. I think the EPI study, which as Mark Lee, you were referring to earlier, there's a quote suggesting the duration of attendance in months is important. An early start under age 3 years is related to better intellectual development. I think this is substantiated by Professor Lisa Wolfson's evidence to the committee. And while there are elements of this for those who are looked after and subject to kinship care orders within the bill, there has been, I think, concerns raised about the relative small numbers that are covered in terms of that additional free provision. I just wonder whether you'd like to offer any observations about how that number might be increased now or in the future, where the priority areas might be, recognising, I think, that a substantial number of 2-year-olds already have access to nursery education, but I suppose the presumption would be this is likely to be those from better off backgrounds rather than those who are perhaps from poorer backgrounds. I don't know whether you have any observations on that.
I think the very nature that actually the government is targeting the looked after children brings in a lot of issues from a practitioner point of view, because actually a lot of children come with behavioural issues, and a lot of children come with a whole host of other issues where the practitioners are having to attend case conferences and actually have meetings with the local authority, child protection, safeguarding people. So it's actually very time-consuming, intense activity for some of these 2-year-olds. And I think that's what we must not undermine in terms of underestimate the amount of time that is actually needed to support these children.
Does this perhaps explain in part of the letter, and the convener mentioned some element of it earlier on today, but in this morning's session, but it also referred to an increase in funding following discussions with COSLA to help cover the costs of provision for 2-year-olds are looked after and subject to kinship care. I mean, is your understanding that additional funding is to reflect the additional workload that goes into delivery for that particular group? So it's not about an expansion of overall numbers or the coverage of the bill. It's simply reflecting a more accurate cost basis for delivery there.
I mean, these children need a lot of one-to-one care. And I think, that is something that needs to be recognised. It's not just the children that need that one-to-one care. A lot of parental support from an early years practitioner point of view within a setting that is actually required. And it is time-consuming, and it requires a lot of skill and expertise to be able to work with the families and not just with the children.
I mean, there is the points have been made that beyond those who are looked after in kinship care, there are those who, for example, have additional support needs, but who are not covered by this bill. Is this something that you've been involved in discussions with, or COSLA have been in discussions with, in order to, I suppose, everybody recognises we're talking about a first step, and presumably there's the aspiration to go forward in due course, but actually whether or not, as a first step, there is more that we could be looking to do at the moment.
I have a concern, though, about expansion of nursery provision for looked after 2-year-olds, and I don't know whether that's necessarily the best solution, because if we're looking at looked after 2-year-olds, presumably they're coming with some degree of disruption and separation within their families, and to place them into a nursery setting where they can be cared for by a variety and quite a large number of people, I would, begs the question, is that the best place for them? One of the things that I would suggest might be better for the child is to look at a more flexible provision with supported childminding attached to a local nursery, so that children have the ability to form close relationships and bonds with a carer rather than with a variety of carers.
It's not the flexibility in your mind within the bill to to deliver that?
There may be flexibility. Again, I think it depends on how local authorities interpret the bill.
We're just looking at the bill, and I'm not a drafts person, but in terms of section 45, paragraph 2 there, I think that does give an element of flexibility. Whether it satisfies colleagues is for them, but our reading of that is that it does give local authorities the ability to be able to tailor supports for looked after if it wouldn't be appropriate, for instance, to give them the same level of childcare and that a non-looked after 2.5-year-old would perhaps receive.
Just for everybody's benefit, it does say that 45 section 2B, I think is what you're referring to.
That's
it
exactly.
Talks about must make such alternative arrangements in relation to the child's education and care, but it considers as it considers appropriate for the purpose of safeguarding and promoting.
The only other point I was wanting to make is the importance that we don't see this as being a single service specific thing. I mean, there's obviously a whole section in the bill related to corporate parenting, and we would argue that it's really the whole of the community planning partnership who would have the ownership of support for the looked after child. So it's that the breadth of support that can be brought to bear is obviously highly important here.
I would really urge the panel in terms of the importance of the clear guidance to local authorities. And unfortunately, the inconsistency comes from how different local authorities interpret the guidance. And I think that's why it's really important to actually have very clear guidelines. And yes, local authorities need to plan according to the local communities and what's required in those communities, but the guidance is absolutely crucial. And we'll be very happy to work with the COSLA and other people to be able to support on that guidance.
Brief question. As I say in the letter from the Minister to the convener of the Finance Committee, it does allude to the additional funding appears to have been drawn from the Early Years Change Fund. I don't know if COSLA can shed any light on whether this means there is something that was going to happen that isn't going to happen. We're constantly told that there's no additional funding. I'm delighted that if this was under-resourced previously, additional funding has been found to ensure that at least it's delivered. But in terms of the bill, and I suppose the fact that we're going into a budget process as well. Last week we certainly heard from Save the Children that they felt that extending the provision to a wider group of TUs, particularly those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, should be a budget priority. Is this something that you would share? And if so, are there particular groups within the more disadvantaged groups that we should be prioritising first, whether those with additional support needs or on the basis of multiple deprivation indexes, or is this something you've given some thought to?
I think there are different ways in terms of looking at the deprivation, and you know, in other countries, free school meals is used as a one of those kind of, you know, the guidelines. But I think you know, what is important is that the professionals who are working with young people, early intervention, and the earliest practitioner are the people who are able to spot those warning signs and warning signals. So even though something might look absolutely perfectly, I mean, unfortunately, we've heard the case this morning about Birmingham, and might look absolutely fine on the surface, but underneath there are a number of those issues, and it really requires a lot of skilled practitioners and workforce to be able to highlight and identify. I think it's absolutely, we need to really look at this in terms of the current extension and see that is actually properly costed out and properly funded because of the intense nature of the work with some of these young children and families before any extensions are actually made in terms of any aspiration. I think that is really important, that local authorities and providers work very closely together to be able to support these children and families.
Yes.
Can we get an answer from COSLA on the issue that Liam just raised there about the letter and about where the money comes from?
I mean, I think, first of all, I was going to say, Convener, with your permission, that I think the point that Robert made as well, just about the community planning partnerships, I mean, all members will be aware of their own areas, and, you know, there are various stages of development and success. But with that, local authorities are working closely with the NHS, and things like the Early Years Collaborative. All these things are pushing the whole agenda in a certain direction, and it's a very positive direction, I think, from our point of view. I think that to answer the specific question, I believe that the funding was additional funding, and that was in there to meet to take from 475 hours to 600. I don't know if you've got any more information on it.
I don't have the letter in front of me, but my understanding certainly was because local authority has been funded for a year or two now for delivery of early learning on childcare for looked after 2-year-olds. I am assuming the letter refers to additional monies in order to bring that up to the 600 hours, but I don't have the letter in front of me. But I'm assuming that's what it's referring to.
What it refers to is that the estimate was of 1.1 million for extending funded early learning and childcare to 2-year-olds who are looked after or subject to a kinship care order. Following helpful discussions with COSLA, we've decided to increase the amount allocated to local government for this priority area by 3.4 million to a total of 4.5 million. Then goes on to suggest that this appears to be from integrated monies via the early years change fund. So that would appear to be where it's come from. As I say, it's welcome if this was previously underfunded in terms of the financial memorandum, that has now been addressed at an early stage of scrutiny of the bill. I suppose just an observation is that we're constantly told there isn't any further funding. This appears to have been brought in. I'm just curious as to whether or not this means that there's something not being done elsewhere, or whether this was always the intention.
From our point,
I mean, if you don't have the facts in front of you, I'm sure the committee would be very grateful if you could write to us with the detail of how this has come about. I mean, I don't want you to jump in and be unsure. If you can answer the question, please do so. But if you need to write to us, that would be helpful.
I'd be more than happy to clarify. I think the point to make about the financial memorandum is that certainly, albeit we have some wanting to ensure that the actual delivery on the ground is able to be achieved. And we've made the point that it takes a number of years for these implementation issues to be worked out. We are satisfied with the resources, certainly for the 600 hours element. But I will go away and check the letter issue and come back to the committee.
Helpful, I think, to the committee if you could just clarify for it in writing, to us in writing. Thank you, Claire Adamson. A brief question.
Thank you, Convener. And I think it's partially been answered, but just for complete clarity, we're not suggesting that this funding is intended to cover everything in the bill, and that early intervention and the other necessary work with looked after children will still go ahead, and it's not expected that that will be all happen within the context of the nursery. Thank you.
Constituencies, you'll know a lot of local authorities are setting up family centres and so on to support the not to 2-year-olds to 3-year-olds. So that's again an important departure from what's happened in the past, and I think these are there just to support this agenda as well.
Yeah. Could I just say I think that's a very welcome move as well, because I think if you're looking at looked after children, there's a lot of family support required, which mainstream nursery very often can't provide.
Thank you very much. Liz Smith.
Could I turn attention to the issue of the named person and the implications for resources of that, but also the implications for communication between the respective professionals. Just on the question of resources, we've obviously had a variety of submissions in terms of the evidence, and I know some people in the second panel will provide more evidence on this, that there is a concern about the degree of additional resources that will be required to implement named person satisfactorily. I can just say that the Royal College of Nursing made it very clear in their submission that they would like to see the health visiting capacity of Scotland needs to be fully reviewed, and that the number of health visitors reflects the workload associated with the named person role. We've seen the Association of Head Teachers and Deputies saying that they're very concerned about the additional burdens for school leadership teams. We've had, obviously, groups like Bernardo's making clear that they feel that there are resource concerns too. Could I just ask you for your thoughts about the extent of the additional resources that will be required and how you think that that can be funded?
Yes, I'm happy to. we know there's a number of assumptions have gone into the totality of the bill to try and cost it up, and these are set out in the financial memorandum. I mean, on the named person, which I should say COSLA supports as a principle, we don't know for sure whether those assumptions are accurate. We hope they are, and if they are, obviously, then they will be they'll meet the cost of the cost of the bill. One of the reasons that we've argued that we need to keep a close eye on expenditure for the bill is because some of the assumptions going into it, while they have been as well made as they can be, are difficult, and we recognise that they're difficult. And it may yet be that on delivery, that the actual implementation costs will outstrip what's within the financial memorandum.
Could you just be a bit more specific on that point as to why you think that might be particularly difficult?
I think we make this point for the named person is because it was one of the areas that was probably trickier to try and estimate the cost, because it's down to the number of hours expected to be carrying out the role. There's an element of travel in there for rural areas as well. So there's a few elements that we know that government have done their best estimates, and we recognise they are best estimates. But in the end, in terms of delivery, that may that may be slightly off the mark, and it's obviously that would worry us. So it's important that when these elements are delivered, and I think by memory it might even be 2017 for some elements of getting it right. So, you know, that's some way off into the future. We need to be absolutely sure that when local authorities go to implement these, and indeed other parts of the public sector, that there is indeed sufficient resources in there to match whatever resource requirements are.
Private sector, yes.
I think lots of day nurseries, you know, within the PVI sector already operate a system called a key worker system. Basically, a child is looked after by a key person, and that operates across all 3 nations. That is actually a standard procedure in many nurseries. But in this instance, I believe it's the health visitor for under 5 from an earliest point of view who will be responsible. We fully support that, but I think what is actually in practice, what we need to be looking at is the skills and expertise and the training of these people to be able to identify, you know, not the normal health visitor approach in terms of the health and well-being of that child, but the other added elements of the difficulties that families have and the child may have. And it's a huge responsibility for one individual. And I think what is important is, I agree with the other submissions in terms of the communication between different professionals, because at the end of the day, whenever there's an unfortunate incident, that's where everything falls down, is a lack of communication between professionals. And I think it's really, really important the capacity issues looked at, and the training and the kind of, you know, expertise of those individuals is looked at as well.
Could I just take up that point on the basis of communication? What has to be achieved to ensure that the communication between the lead professionals, particularly if it's the communication between the health visitor and the nursery teacher, or going into primary school, transferring the information onto the named person in the primary school, what has to happen to ensure that that communication is better than what we have in the existing system?
I think what is important is across Scotland there are provider networks, the PVI provider networks, who actually work very closely with local authorities, and sometimes local authorities coordinate these networks locally. Those are the kind of areas, places where people would actually communicate about some of these needs, and because we must appreciate that some of that information that needs to be shared has got other things attached to it in terms of confidentiality on all these issues. But there are existing forums that already actually happen, but what needs to be happening at a local level is it needs to be much more structured and streamlined to be able to have that, because that transition from an early year setting into a primary school is really important.
How do you see that structure developing?
I think it can happen. I mean, we worked with local authorities in a number of areas where it can actually work in setting up a network in that local authority area, or 2 or 3 local authorities working together to establish a network to be able to share the best practice, but at the same time share also not so best practice, which is how we learn.
Could I just ask you, you mentioned very interestingly in your first remark there that, you know, if a problem does arise, which inevitably it does from time to time, do you have any concerns about who is liable for passing on that information about the problem in this new setup? I mean, obviously communication would have to be first class to ensure that there wasn't a problem. What's your understanding about the spreading the process of named person principle across all of Scotland? Do you feel that there's any issue there about the liability of passing on information?
There are absolutely issues with liability, not only liability in terms of the individual and their kind of, legal implications, because a lot of practitioners absolutely scared to even highlight it to a parent, by the way, Johnny is having some problems here, because a parent might react completely differently and say, well, how dare you to actually suggest that my child has got an issue. So the practitioners have to really have that confidence to actually think about how am I going to get this message across. And I think if there is a named person, that is actually a really not good route to actually that professional to have that dialogue with that individual to say, look, I'm really concerned about this. How do we handle this? How do we actually get this message across? Because lots of early years practitioners are really, really worried about the legal implications and the legal challenges. And of course, the complaints to the regulator as a result of that. And this happens regularly.
Do the local authorities have concerns about this aspect, about the legality of some of this and the concerns about what happens with confidentiality?
Issues highlighted to us specifically. I think local authorities have been operating for some time a variety of approaches about integrating services. So, this isn't coming straight from, left field, so to speak. It is something that builds on what councils have been operating. But those two particular issues haven't been highlighted to us particularly.
They obviously have been within some of the submissions that the committee has received. In fact, quite a reasonable number of submissions have raised this concern. Do you feel that local authorities would be in the front line of having to address that, or should this be left to lawyers and solicitors?
To be careful, I'm not sure much should be left to lawyers and solicitors, but I suppose, what we, if there are some genuine issues, obviously they have to come out in the debate in committee. They haven't been highlighted to us in particular, but if they were, then we'd obviously we'd want to take those up with government to ensure that the implementation of this is something that happens as smooth as possible, because that's in the end what we would want.
My final question is obviously within the submissions, broadly speaking, there's quite a reasonable degree of support for the principle of the named person. When it comes to the practicalities, that is less true. In fact, there's a lot of concern about it. Are you comfortable as local authorities that you can overcome these difficulties without very substantial additional costs to the local authorities, plus issues about the confidentiality of data sharing and all things? Are you confident that these practicalities can be overcome?
As I said before, it's on the implementation that to some extent many of these might come to the fore. So I think that's why we're looking for, obviously we'd want to iron any issues out as quickly as possible, but in terms of the resource implications, that's why I think we really need to keep a very close eye on all the implementation costs of the bill, so that local authorities do have sufficient resources to be able to implement it.
A very brief comment, if you don't mind.
The private and voluntary providers will feel very vulnerable because it's their own businesses, it's their own livelihood. And I think what needs to happen is actually there needs to be that support from the local authority. If a child is funded and goes to a setting, there needs to be some support from local authority to be able to actually help them and support them to go through that process.
Could I just make a point?
If it's a brief one, you can.
A brief one. The previous system when I worked in family centres was that the family centre had a link health visitor and a link social worker, and they were the first point of contact. And I think that would actually be quite a good idea, where the key worker in an establishment could approach their link or liaison person who could then transfer that information. All key workers are bound by confidentiality and are used to working under those situations.
Can I thank both Purnima and Joan for the moment? We've got some very specific questions to COSLA on other aspects of the bill we want to do just now. So if you don't mind, we'll just direct some questions towards Douglas and Robert. I'm sure they are very appreciative of that, but can I ask Neil to take us start us here?
Yep. Thanks, Convener. Just to ask COSLA some questions on the relationship between local government and national government. You've raised concerns about the effect on local democracy, particularly, first of all, about Part 3, Section 17, which would proposals to give ministerial powers to establish joint boards for the planning of children's services, and that ministers could transfer property, assets and staff without the agreement of the local authority. You stated in your evidence that you understand the government wanting to successfully implement its policies, but you do not support, or COSLA do not support this. My question on it would be, what other options or penalties would be available to the Scottish Government to enforce the implementation of its policies if local authorities are not following guidance?
You know, I think there've been considerable movement from the government since I think the report was put in, and you know, obviously from our point of view, we've had a fairly robust debate within COSLA regarding that section of the bill, to put it mildly. But where we are just now is we now have, I think, agreement from the Minister for Local Government, Derek Mackay. He wrote to the President on the 28th of August to say that section of the bill would be withdrawn. And I think Robert's still in discussions with civil servants regarding that. So, you know, I think we're in a much better position now than we were before in terms of what would have been unacceptable conditions placed within the bill as regards the imposition of joint boards and so on. It was never clear what the you know, how they'd be set up, who'd sort of drive these forward and so on. So, you know, I think that's where we are at the moment as regards to the bill. But obviously, there's other amendments to be forwarded within Section 2 of the bill. So we wait to make sure that the letter we've had from Mr Mackay is followed through in amendment.
Okay. So you're happy with that? That's been withdrawn? Sorted. Happy. Everyone's happy with that? Okay.
On that, I think it was your point about penalties. I think the chief reason for not supporting that bill is because there's not much within Part 3 in terms of our desire for integrating services that we wouldn't want to support. There's a strong desire on part of local government to get the integration of services, planning for children, the integration with community planning, absolutely right. And we felt that this would actually be a worse position than we would have won. There are some remaining issues we are in discussion with government on, but as Douglas said, we have made significant progress with government, and we hope that that will be resolved.
There was another area I was going to ask you about, the children's hearing system. The Scottish Parliament, during the Children's Hearings Bill, gave local authorities the right to reach agreement on resources for children's hearing and area support teams. The bill would proposed would remove this and give the National Convener the power to compel local authorities to provide resources. Have the current arrangements made implementation more difficult and justify this move? Or has this been sorted as well?
No, sadly, this one hasn't been sorted. No, I mean, for members who've been involved in this for some time, they'll remember we did not support many of the changes through the 2011 Act. One of our chief concerns, which we've highlighted in the response, was the ability for the national convener to be able to effectively compel authorities to either become part of an area support team or transfer staff and budgets. Now, we recognise that the Act is now in force, and authorities have been working with the Children's Hearing Scotland to put the new arrangements in place. However, we would argue that it's far better to reach mutual agreement with the various parties rather than have any one side of trying to compel the other to do something that, for potentially very good reasons, they might think is not appropriate for them. So we think that the Act should be left, the 2011 Act should be left as it is, and those sections of the bill should not this bill shouldn't go forward. However, we understand that government take a different point of view of that, so we'll still be making these points during our evidence and, I dare say, at stage 2 of the bill as well.
And another area was keen to ask you, in Part 11, COSLA have raised concerns about the requirement that local authorities use the National Adoption Register. Can I ask you in what circumstances would it not be in the interests of the children to have access to the largest pool of adopted parents?
On this one, I think our position is a pragmatic one. We certainly have no principal problem about the National Adoption Register. I think where we recognise that there are some local arrangements that work well, and if those do work well, then and those are meeting needs for children, then we would argue that they should be able to continue. Obviously, there will be times where being able to have maybe a larger group of families is important to be able to access. I think what we're arguing for is if there are local arrangements that currently work, we shouldn't be compelling people to necessarily change to something else unless they could demonstrate it genuinely adds value.
We look forward, I'm sure, with interest to the amendment the government will bring forward on the joint boards issue. I'm sure you will as well. Are there any other issues that COSLA wants to raise at this point?
I think we've covered most of the areas here. I think that our chief issue that we've highlighted is the one. While we're satisfied that there are sufficient resources for the 600 hours, there are other parts of the bill where the financial assumptions are genuinely complex, and it's only when you start to actually do it on the ground do you realise what the resource implications will be. So really the idea that we'll need to keep a close eye on it, as we've said, is probably the single most important thing from our point of view.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all the witnesses this morning for coming along? It's been very helpful evidence session on the bill, and I will suspend briefly so we can change panels. Thank you. Can I welcome to the committee our second panel of witnesses this morning, who will focus on the issues of the named person and the child's plan in the main, although I'm sure we'll cover one or two other areas as well. Can I welcome Martin Crew from Barnardo, Scotland, Greg Dempster, Association of Head Teachers and Deputes in Scotland, Claire Mayo, Royal College of Nursing Scotland, and Jackie Mitchell, Royal College of Midwives Scotland. And again, given the agenda we have this morning and the issues we have to get through, we'll move straight to questions. Can I begin with Liz Smith?
Thank you, Convener. Could I continue on the theme of the named person issues when it comes to resources? We've had a huge variation in terms of the evidence, with some people arguing that effectively it's just existing practice being formalised, and therefore there isn't a huge extra cost of resources, round to those who are arguing that there are very substantial resources extra. Could I ask you specifically to comment on your concerns about the resource aspect of introducing a named person for a universal basis across Scotland?
Who would like to start us off? Okay, Greg.
Yeah, I think that the area of our concern is really about the projections that are in the explanatory notes that accompanied the bill. They talk about training and no cost associated with backfilling for head teachers in post, and 10% of costs backfilled for deputes and 30% backfilled for PTs. The last one of that might be accurate. Deputes around the country are in class a lot more than they were in previous years. A couple of authorities have in recent years reduced, or rather increased, the threshold in terms of numbers of pupils before schools qualify to have a depute or a second depute, which means that there's more time in class and less scope to get management time out for free, as it supposes in there. And head teachers, we were talking about 2 days training. You've got authorities like Highland, where I think it was a couple of years ago now, they moved from a position where teaching heads had 3 days non-class contact time to effectively 1 day non-class contact time. So asking to take a 2-day set of training and suggesting it would have no cost surprises me somewhat. Also, the assumption, and this is at a very simple level, must be that everybody would be taking a flask and a packed lunch to the training. No cost for meeting rooms, no cost for trainers and so on. It just doesn't seem to really get into the detail at all. I was interested in COSLA's comments in the last evidence session that this area around about named person was one where they knew that the costs were very hard to quantify, and so they were less reliable than on the 600 hours. But there are certainly elements within there that could be quantified a bit better than they are already. And then if you move on to the operation, the suggestion seems to be from the costs that are projected that they would be 1 year costs, and then it would just be rolled forward, and there wouldn't be renewed training costs and so on. That seems to me to be wholly unlikely.
Up for a second. Can I, on that specific point about rolling on training costs, surely in future years, that kind of training would just be rolled into the normal training that the individual undertake, rather than having to be additional separate training like startup costs.
So, what other training would be dropped to make it a neutral cost? You know, if you're saying that this is an additional thing that people need to be trained to do, there's a cost associated with that. I don't see that simply that it becomes part of people's normal training, that makes it somehow free in future years.
The original question from Liz Smith included, part of the question was about whether you viewed it as part of somebody's job at the moment. I mean, we're not starting from year zero here. Surely a lot of this work is already done.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I agree with that point in part. I agree with the first part wholly. We're not starting from year zero. Scotland is on a GIRFEC implementation journey, and different authorities are at different places on that journey, and therefore will have different training costs. But there's a difference between the landscape now and the landscape that people have been trained for now, and the landscape that will exist after this bill becomes an act. And that, I think, could force changes in practice in different authorities, and certainly could mean there was a need for more training for those who have already been trained and new training to be developed around about things like information sharing protocols, which I'm sure we'll come on to if nothing else.
Yeah, does anybody else want to comment on the extent of the resources?
Just to say, firstly, the Royal College of Nursing welcomes the Children and Young People Scotland Bill and the opportunities it presents to make a real difference to children's rights and children's services at this point. In terms of funding for the named person, the implementation of the named person and the child's plan as set out in the bill requires significant funding that enables the named person to form a meaningful relationship with families and children, and that requires time. We really welcome the figures set out in the financial memorandum. The Scottish Government have worked hard to come up with figures that actually represent the time involved. Our evidence, the Finance Committee, you may have seen, we have some comments around the way in which those calculations have been developed. I think the first and most important one is that there are insufficient health visitors at present in Scotland to undertake the role, and so a significant sum needs to be made available to train more health visitors, and that's currently not taken into account. There are no implementation costs allocated until 2016-17, and all the professional time that's calculated is on an hourly basis, and it doesn't take into account associated employment costs. The Scottish Government's calculations around employment costs are currently about adding an additional 22.5% when you go from hourly rates to actually developing a workforce, which allows for annual leave, sick leave, maternity leave, all those sorts of things. And that hasn't been factored in. So in order to make available the number of additional hours currently within the financial memorandum, that 22.5% hasn't been added as a start. And there are other assumptions which we have questioned. There's no additional administrative support budgeted to support NHS staff. And the GERFEC approach, as it beds in, the costs have been seen to decrease year on year at a rate of about 20%, which we believe overstates the reduction as time goes on, because the level of funding that's allocated in the first instance will need to be sustained for a significant period of time before we see the benefits of the getting it right for every child approach.
So I'd just like to echo a lot of the things that Claire said, and it'd be quite similar for midwives. Obviously, midwives don't have much input with the child, you know, after it's born, really. Only look after it for about the first 10 days and then hand the care over to the health visitor. But we do have a significant input, obviously, in the antenatal period. And that's where, you know, through the GERFEC programme, you're looking at doing a lot of the initial assessments and identifying the needs. GERFEC is not being rolled out maternity services unilaterally across all health boards. Some use the programme particularly well. In other areas, you know, there's really not much input into GERFEC. If you ask midwives, they'll tell you they'll know what GERFEC's about, but they're not actually using it. Now, part of that is because perhaps they haven't been trained in its use, or the systems aren't there, and so it's still that training and that needs to be accounted for.
Thank you very much.
I think there has been somewhat of a mixed message in this, and undoubtedly, as the other panellists have said, that there is an initial training period. I think one of the things to get in perspective is how much GERFEC is being rolled out now. And as well as my Bernardo's experience, I'm Deputy Chair of the GERFEC Programme Board, and we've recently assessed across all 32 CPPs what the current state of rollout is. And with regard to the named person, 2 CPPs describe it as embedded, another 4 talk about well on the way to implementing, and another 19 are in the development phase. So clearly CPPs are now moving ahead with named person and addressing some of these issues as part of what they're doing. I think the other thing is, in terms of the longer term, what we're seeing in Highland and elsewhere is that the resource demands move in the system, and one of the most powerful arguments around GERFEC is the fact that the non-offence referral rates to the reporter have dropped significantly, and that means there's less pressure on some parts of the system. It's a more efficient system for children and young people, but in the short term, it is going to put pressure on some other parts. And I think it's worth remembering John Carnacan, the ex-head of the Violence Reduction Unit, saying that in the long run, 1,000 extra health visitors is more effective than 1,000 extra police officers.
Can I just have a point of clarification there? You mentioned 19 local authorities plus 4 plus 2. That leaves 7, I think.
Yeah.
Is that just because they haven't responded, or is there a problem there?
No, everybody responded, but people are in different stages of development. I mean, GERFIC's been around for a number of years, and one thing which is absolutely clear is that this bill has galvanised people's efforts to implement, and I would say that we've made more progress in the last year than we had in the previous 5.
The 7 that you didn't put into one of these categories, is there any concern at all there or not?
Well, they're further back in the process, and it's a self-assessment, but you know, everybody is now focused on how we're going to make this happen for 2015.
Thank you. Can I just go on to the second question that I asked the previous panel? In terms of the need for greater communication, more effective communication between the named person and the professionals, I wonder if you could comment on this, and if you could include, Mr Dempster, in your comments about the issue about data sharing that I know you have concerns about. What do we have to do to make this work better?
Okay, looks like it's me again. The first thing I would say is that around about information sharing, there's been a lot of concern expressed in different pieces of evidence that have been submitted to the committee and in the media. As an association, we don't share a lot of that concern. What our concerns around that are slightly different. We don't think that the issues of confidentiality are huge issues that can't be overcome. And I think that the Information Commissioner's response to the committee highlighted to me that he was talking about minor tweaks required really to the bill rather than wholesale change around about information sharing and confidentiality. The information sharing protocols that are put in place and the guidance that comes along with the bill about sharing information with the named person, and then what the named person then does with that, will be very important. And beyond seeking clarity in that, I don't know that I've got a great deal more to say on that point.
I mean, I think in terms of confidentiality, it's important to remember that the named person, there is a presumption of confidentiality when information is shared to them. So they are then the gatekeeper of information. And one of the problems in the current system is that because people are less certain who to take the information to, particularly those agencies who maybe don't do this on a regular basis. We've had examples, for instance, from the fire brigade who've got a concern and will then send the information to 4 or 5 different other agencies because they're not quite sure where it should go. Whereas the advantage of a named person is that is clearly the person who coordinates that information. And then that named person, that professional, then has to make an informed decision on who they share that information with. And there's presumptions of confidentiality all along the way. So I think it is a potentially better system than we have currently.
And do you believe that because you feel that under the present system, not only is there a lack of clarity about how to share or with whom to share the information, but because you feel that people aren't sufficiently aware of their responsibilities in that?
I think people lack some confidence. A subgroup of the GERFEC Programme Board, this is why we met at the end of last year with Ken MacDonald from the Information Commissioner's Office to clarify some of this in terms of that people don't know how the Data Protection Act works, and we've got very useful clarification which has been sent out to statutory agencies in March, which says very clearly that professionals, if they believe that there is a risk to a child or young person that may lead to harm, then they should share that information. And I think that that's very much in support of the move to a more well-being approach. And, you know, as has been said earlier, whenever there is a significant case review, what always seems to come out is that somebody had some information which, had another professional known, would have affected how they would behave.
In your discussions with the Information Commissioner, is it your understanding that in the question of named person, that if some problem does arise, that it is the responsibility of that named person to, in the final result, explain why that problem arose?
The named person has a responsibility as a professional to make an informed decision on who they share the information with. I think that is effectively a greater clarity of the current position.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just clarify? I know I raised this with Craig earlier, but on the issue of named person, is it something brand new, or is it effectively quantifying what staff professionals already do? I mean, or is there something? Is it somewhere in between the two?
I suppose it's the third option. It's somewhere in between the two, in the sense that every authority is in a different point, as Martin was saying, in terms of implementation of GERFEC. So the named person as a role is something that's new in some areas, or newer, and but largely what would be done as a named person you would expect to have been done previously, but there are the training aspect comes in because there's a legislative aspect coming in, and there will be specific provisions around about information and so on that need to be addressed and people need to be made aware of, so that they can do the new version of named person, as it were.
Does that sum up the position?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the role is as it's being developed within Getting It Right for Every Child, and as Claire Simpson said last week, the request for there to be a single point of contact came from parents who were saying, you know, in a complex multi-agency landscape, we don't know who to get in touch with. And so the request for there being a named person, and a named midwife, a named health visitor, a named teacher came, so there is clarity for everyone who that first point of contact is.
We started talking on the information sharing a little bit earlier than intended, so I'm going to bring in Claire Adamson at this point to just expand on that.
Thank you, Convener. In the bill, service providers, it requires service providers to share information with the named person and vice versa, where it, quote, might be relevant to a child's well-being and ought to be shared. Are you content that we will reach a common understanding of a child's well-being in this process? And is there a danger that that might mean different things in different local authority areas?
A huge amount of work has been done in GERFEC implementation in terms of development, training, consistency, and in the areas where GERFEC is well implemented, there has been significant improvement in information sharing, and professionals are now confident in what needs to be shared, to whom and how. And it's one of the real successes of GERFEC is the way in which professionals are working together and sharing information in an effective way. So whilst I think we need to be quite careful how what goes in the bill is worded, we need some caveats and clarification around confidentiality and consent and involving children and families in what's shared. I think in practice, a huge amount of work has been done, and there is good guidance and good training which we can build on as the implementation rolls out.
I think that is important. It is about, you know, the building on it and the rolling out. Certainly, you know, if I speak from midwives, they're quite clear about their responsibility information sharing, particularly in cases of like child protection. But I think sometimes when perhaps the needs or the vulnerability isn't quite as severe as like child protection issues, there is a little bit of perhaps not being quite sure and perhaps maybe give too much information, you know, so there is still, I think, a bit of a learning curve out there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I just echo some of Claire's comments, because as I said earlier, GERFEC's been around for some time. I think one of the if you're coming to this fresh, the danger is that well-being sounds like a rather fluffy, ill-defined term. In actual fact, that there's the definitions of well-being around what's called the Shinari indicators are very clearly established. There are tools which have been developed which have been really widely accepted across agencies, and having a common language is a real benefit here. And I think the threshold issue of working at a well-being level does address some of the issues around we're not always sure when something relating to a child is a matter of concern, and if we have such a high threshold that it has to be harmful, then that's a concern that we don't pick up things early enough.
I would echo what's been said. Also, just add that in discussion with my members, so school leaders from primaries, nurseries, and special schools, when talking to them about this bill, they've often referred to difficulties with current delivery of GERFEC because they struggle to get other partners to share information or to come around the table. So the duty to share information and to help the named person is one that they welcome.
And Greg, you mentioned training and training requirements. Do you think it's necessary that to ensure that all frontline staff will be able to make good judgments about the information that ought to be shared, that there is a significant amount of training still to be done, or is that very much established because of GERFEC?
There is training in place, and we've kind of covered this point to a degree, but my concern is that this bill changes the landscape depending on what ends up in the bill and what ends up in the guidance, and therefore that may require a revision and further training.
A brief follow-up question. I think, Jackie, you mentioned the issues where there may be problems of an excessive amount of information being provided. I mean, I think everybody's alluded to problems in serious case reviews where not enough information was provided or provided in a timely fashion. Is there a risk that that creates perhaps either a degree of white noise and therefore actually filtering out the most relevant information becomes more difficult, or indeed it just creates a quantum of information that adds additional kind of time and resource problems for other sort of professionals involved in the process?
Point I was trying to make there, that can sometimes be the case, but obviously with education and training and you know, obviously support mechanisms initially as it's being rolled out, you know, that will improve.
Can I just clarify a couple of points on this area? Last week we had some, well, I'll call it evidence, but we had some confusion over whether or not parents would be able to access the information that's effectively, you know, being provided by professionals about their child. What is your understanding on this issue? Will parents be allowed to access that shared information? Will parents be one of the people that information is shared with? I'm getting the same level of confusion given the silence.
I think it will depend on the circumstances. I mean, I think, you know, we would want to give due regard to parental views and the views of children, but it will depend on the circumstances.
And there is current guidance around access to records, medical records, and that, you know, that's already there and that stands. And I suppose the other thing to say in this context is that GERFEC principles are about involving parents and children. So no one's trying to hide information. The whole ethos of getting it right for every child is to have the child and family at the heart of everything that's planned. Everything is done collaboratively as far as that's possible. Now, clearly there are circumstances when things get complicated and then we're in different territory, but as a principle, GERFEC, and I therefore assume the named person approach, is about working with children and families, and so information is always shared in the spirit of partnership and working together in the best interests of a child.
And certainly from a midwifery point of view, I mean, obviously the child's not born yet, but that assessment's all documented in the woman's handheld maternity records, which she carries about with her, so has that full information and actually inputs into it.
Supplementaries, I think. Yeah, Liam and then Claire.
Just a very quick one. Claire, you talked about the fact that a lot of this is established in terms of precedent about access to the information. I think one of the concerns that was expressed in our earlier evidence session from Professor Norrie was that in terms of Section 27, there was a fear that this kind of would override data protection rules and all the rest of it, and there was a kind of sense that this bill may go quite considerably further in terms of information sharing than what is established at present. So, I mean, it'd be helpful to get your views on whether or not you see that as a risk and whether Section 27 and aspects of Section 26 need to be addressed.
I think there needs to be a tightening up of language around sections 26 and 27, and we need absolute clarity. My understanding is that all existing data protection law stands and that everything within this bill is entirely compatible with existing legislation. But I think that's one for the lawyers to ensure that the wording is clear, and from our point of view, I would like to see additional caveats around consent and involvement and permission for information sharing. So there are things that need tightening up, but my understanding is that all existing legislation stands and needs to be entirely compatible with what goes in to this bill.
The others agree with that? Yeah. Okay, I'll just move on. Claire.
Very brief supplementary on that. You talked about consent. The example that was given in a previous evidence session was of a teenager, and this is about the balance of the rights of the child and the right to privacy, where they'd expressed that they were lesbian or gay. I can't remember the circumstance, but that information was imparted to the parents without the child's consent or the young person's consent. Are you content that issues like that can be resolved through guidance and through tightening up of the wording, or are you still concerned that there is a danger that the rights of the child and the implications of the bill will still be out of kilter in certain aspects?
I think it's hard to legislate for those kinds of things. Those are practice issues, and there should be clear guidance that means that something like that wouldn't happen. But yes, I think those are practice issues, and you can't legislate for every eventuality.
Joan, if you've got a brief supplementary.
Mr. Crew said that well-being was assessed using the Shinari indicators, and as I understand it, the Shinari indicators mean safe, healthy, achieving, nurtured, active, respected, responsible and included. If well-being is a trigger for information sharing, and one could come along and say this child isn't achieving, therefore there's a threat to the well-being, which then triggers information sharing, that could apply to every single child in the country, couldn't it?
Could potentially, but I mean, I think what if you look at our systems now, where they tend to work well is at the crisis point. We've got good crisis intervention, we've got good universal support. What we're not so good at is the gap in between, where we want to go a little bit beyond universal support to give a bit of extra help to families and do it as early as possible. And if there is a concern around achieving, then that can be helped by a bit of support, then I think that's absolutely appropriate.
It could also include an active, if somebody decided your child wasn't active enough. It's all quite subjective, isn't it?
There's a degree of subjectivity, but what we're talking about is a professional assessment from different agencies. I don't think we are going to get our experience is that there isn't a flood of sort of white noise, as Liam referred to it, that people still have their professional standards. One of Bernardo's concerns over many years is that if we report a certain level of concern about a family to social work, which we think might be concerned, that we don't hit their thresholds. I think having a slightly lower level of around the named person is absolutely right. We've had in the news today, we've had the Daniel Pelker case, which is very concerning. But a child foraging for food in bins at school, that is a level of concern that we would hope would be picked up in to the named person.
Thank you. Neil Bippy.
Thanks. Just on the named person, just wanted to ask you specifically who you think the named person should be for children. Are the Scottish Government's proposals the right ones, and would you have any proposed changes to who the named person should be?
I'll start with Jackie, and we'll run along the line. Jackie.
Well, again, in the bill, it talks about the preschool child, and so, I suppose there's a bit of lack of clarity there. If you're looking at just the child from when it's born and those first 10 days that the midwife looks after it, then it's not appropriate for the midwife to be that named person. But if you're taking the antenatal period in, as under the GIRFEC programme, then yes, it is appropriate that the midwife be that named person. There's policy documents out there for midwifery that say that all pregnant women should have a named midwife for their care, whether they're of low risk or high risk in their pregnancy, and that the midwife is a lead professional for that low risk woman with the low risk pregnancy. So that would fit in nicely with the midwife being the named person, during the pregnancy and that first 10 days before handover to the health visitor.
I think that post 5 or starting in primary school, the named person resting with education makes sense as a universal service. There's a kind of a split view in members I've spoken to about whether the named person should also be in education from nursery. I don't have a clear view from a membership around about that, but there's certainly a debate about whether it should be resting with education from when the time that the child starts nursery.
I think one of the important points to bear in mind here is that for the vast majority of parents, what we're talking about is a named coordination point so that they know who it is. So I think having a level of consistency across health visitor and then education is enormously helpful. That there's going to be a small number of exceptions where that doesn't fit, but I think that we can deal with that.
Claire?
Our view is clearly that there should be a named midwife, a named health visitor, a named teacher at those appropriate times. And I think for all under 5s, that should be a health visitor, as health visitors are the only group that have universal access to children and families and have the skills required to support early years development, health and wellbeing. And we'd also like to see within the bill an additional clause that actually gave every family in Scotland the right to universal health visiting services. And I think that could go into section 20, paragraph 1.
On the issue of health visitors being the named person till children reaches the age of 5, and I know you've said earlier and also in your written evidence that the health visiting capacity needs to be reviewed, and the number of health visitors must reflect the workload associated with the named person. At the moment, at this moment in time, could the health visiting service effectively take on this role?
It needs rapid investment. I believe it's the right workforce to take on this role, and significant investment is required. But I think if we are going to do what the policy memorandum states in terms of investing in early years, and I think the financial memorandum makes the case really well in terms of a failure to intervene effectively to address complex needs in the early years of an individual's life results in a 9-fold increase in public costs over the long term. It is about making that investment now so we have the universal support for every child in Scotland in the early years. So we've got people who can intervene early and give the support that makes a difference as soon as possible. So in answer to your question, no, we do not have the capacity right now, which is why we need urgent investment.
In terms of that urgent investment, do you have, for example, an estimated number of additional health visitors you think that we need in order to effectively implement the named person?
The financial memorandum sets out what it believes the additional hours of health visiting time required are. And we would suggest that, as I mentioned earlier, an additional 22.5% needs to be added to that, because you can't pluck hours out of the air. They need to be posts, and in order to create posts from those hours, we need to build in that additional capacity. If you divide what Scottish Government believes the number of hours should be by full-time hours, it comes out at something in excess of, I haven't got the wrong piece of paper, it's around 350 additional health visitors. So if you add the 22.5%, you're looking at something in the region of 450 additional health visitors across Scotland.
Just ask the panel about education, and there's been concerns raised about the named person at school, and that children spend 38 weeks a year at school, but 14 weeks they obviously don't. So what practical problems do you think this would create, and how accessible would the named person be for those 14 weeks? We've heard that it might be somebody, it moved to somebody in the education department of a local authority. And do you think this undermines the effectiveness of the named person?
Greg. I think that this is something that's moved on from the initial discussion and proposals with the Scottish Government. The initial proposals, or sorry, the bill as it stands talks about a named person service, which I think clarifies that point, in that the named person will come from education, and during school term time that will be someone from schools most likely, and outside of term time the service will have to be provided from elsewhere within the authority. Now, your question about how effective that will be remains to be seen, but it's more effective to have a plan for somebody from the authority to be able to support than it is to assume that somebody's going to be available whilst they're on holiday.
Okay, can I ask what might seem a rather simplistic question, but is everybody of the view that the introduction of a named person will actually reduce the amount of neglect that children have to suffer in Scotland? That would be my hope as well, but I'm asking you whether you think in a practical sense the introduction of a named person will actually lead to a better service and therefore will lead to a reduction in neglect.
Growing evidence base from the UK and internationally about the importance of early years intervention, much of which has been already examined as this bill was developed. But I think increasingly there's quite robust evidence that says if we have a comprehensive approach to universal services with tiered support, then we will indeed be investing in the future of children's lives and consequently reducing neglect, improving mental health, improving attachment relationships, and the things that we know increasingly make a difference to children into their adolescence and becoming adults themselves. So yes, I believe this is an opportunity to invest in the lives of every child in Scotland by providing the kind of universal support that's required with the additional tiered services that have been shown to make a difference elsewhere in the world. We've got that opportunity for Scotland now.
I think it's I think this is the fundamental arguments that we've been moving to for some years now, with the early years initiatives, with the Christie Commission, with all of these things saying, how can we get into the preventative area? I was talking to Mike Burns from Glasgow Social Work Department last week, and they've done an internal assessment of 18 of the most high-end cases, the sorts of cases which are young people at the age of 15 going into secure accommodation or residential care, costing £200,000 a year each or more. And of those 18, at least 12 of them were known at age 3 to be problematic in nursery in their behaviour. Now, if we could have got in much earlier there, I think that's where we need to focus our resources.
Any other comments? Anybody else?
The whole thing is designed to head off issues at an earlier stage, and I believe it will achieve that, so the answer is yes.
Hey, Jackie.
Yeah, early identification and the support and at the very early stages.
Thank you very much.
You a tiny bit from a case study that's on the RCN Health Visitors for Scotland website. This is a health visitor who's working with a family in Ayrshire and Arran, which is one of the areas that is well on the way with implementing GERFEC. She's working with a family who have 4 children. Both mum and dad have long-standing heroin issues, and the health visitor is heavily involved. She's working with them, looking at what their goals are for their children, and she's been seeing the family every 2 weeks, and more often if necessary. Both parents are now on a methadone programme and doing really well. At the same time, their self-esteem is raised and they're able to do things for themselves that they've never been able to do. They're booking their own appointments and attending without support. When I visit them, I can see them with their shoulders back. They speak better, they make eye contact, and the children and mum and dad are happy to attend groups in school. The older children's school attendance and schoolwork has improved dramatically, and whereas before they went to school periodically and were not well dressed or clean, now it's the opposite. The baby's also thriving and well attached to mum and dad, and for the first time in her life, the mum's considering her own future and thinking about training for a career. That's the kind of difference we're hoping to make.
I want to move on. Colin, you've got some questions.
I'd like to explore a little bit of the bureaucracy around part of this bill. The bill allows for a child's plan in certain cases where there's intervention necessary, but it doesn't actually allow for any changes to existing assessments and plans that get put in place. And one of the things that one of the previous witnesses said was that there's 11 different assessments have to be done for every child. How is this going to work? GERFEC is supposed to reduce bureaucracy and it's supposed to achieve a single child's plan. The bill doesn't require it, doesn't refer to that at all. How do you think this is going to work?
In terms of GERFEC implementation, having a single child's planning system and a single child's plan is absolutely essential. I think there's one area of the bill which we would like to see a bit more clarification on in terms of the additional support for learning plans, because clearly it is in the child's best interest that we have a single plan in place.
Feed into all these other plans and assessments that supposedly are out there.
My understanding is that they would sit within the child's plan, but I would agree that it is an area that I think it would be useful that if the child's plan did bring a bit more coherence to that. I think it's expressed really well in evidence from the advisory group on additional support for learning that was submitted to yourselves. It's paragraphs 17 to 19 of their evidence, and I think that would summarise well what my position would be as well. And it's about bringing coherence and the ambition of achieving that single plan.
Does anyone else have a view?
I think certainly what I'm hearing from members is that the GERFEC approach is reducing bureaucracy rather than increasing it, and where you may have had a large case conference several years ago with a room full of professionals, that actually the Shinari approach, the wellbeing approach and the assessments that are in place mean that the right information is fed to the named person, and instead of having a large case conference, which is very intimidating for parents, the named person and the lead professional will go and sit down with the family in their own home and go through the child's plan. And that's so much better and less bureaucratic than some of the systems that were in place before.
Are we clear about the relationship between lead professionals and named persons?
I think we are. The guidance on that is very clear that that the named person is the coordination point and is only up to the point of coordinating some additional support. The moment that we're starting to talk into managing a child's plan, then we are starting to move into lead professional territory. And I think the statutory guidance behind the bill will reflect what is now quite a large body of how best this works, which we've got established across a number of CPPs now.
I certainly think it's a lot more clearer now. Certainly in the earlier days, you know, when GIRFEC was being rolled out, there was some concerns, you know, about the lead professional, the named person. But I think that is very clear now with practitioners out there.
I would put on it is that I haven't seen the guidance, so I don't know what's in the guidance that will support the bill, but if it reflects current understanding about the roles, then yeah.
Okay, Liam MacArthur.
Thanks. Camilla, can I touch very briefly on part 8 of the bill? Obviously, I think there's been a lot of focus on different aspects of it. One of the ones I are particularly pleased to see is part 8 and the increase in the age from 21 to 26 for aftercare for those leaving care. I think probably it's only fair to acknowledge probably the work that Bernardo's and Aberlour put in, I think, in prosecuting the case for this. Welcome though is, I think I'm also aware there perhaps some concerns about some of the clarity around this, about the extent to which it would apply, possibly not to those that are looked after at home in terms of aftercare, the anomaly in terms of when a child may leave school and whether or not they're deemed to be in care or not, and how that might apply the aftercare provisions and the eligibility. Also, dispute resolution mechanisms seem to be absent. Maybe not from the bill. Maybe this is something for guidance. I'm not sure. I just wonder whether, Martin, you had any comments that it would be helpful for the committee to bear in mind that we may be able to take forward as part of stage 2 amendments, but in terms of the general principles, be helpful in terms of providing a bit more detail.
So, I mean, we are very supportive of supporting care leavers up to age 26. We've got wide experience in this area, and there's no doubt that young people who often want to leave care at 16 are not suited to it, and it takes them some years to get onto a stable path, often through many problems with accommodation and various other things which they have to try and fail at before finding their way. We've got a number of detailed comments which we'd like to submit separately to the committee on this. As you mentioned, the making sure that aftercare is available for all looked after children, including those who've been not accommodated but looked after at home. The eligibility criteria around the birth date, but also if a young person's been in care for a substantial period of their young life and then is not in care at 16, we still think they should be eligible for support. And I think if we will need some sort of dispute resolution process, and within that we think it's very important that the young people have access to advocacy on their behalf. So there's a number of issues there. We'd also like to see that if there's the death of a young person who's still being supported in aftercare, that should lead to a significant case review, as it would do if they're in care now. So we'd like to see a number of measures sort of tightened up in this area, but I think there's a level of detail which we'd like to submit in writing.
If you could do, I'm sure the committee would appreciate that. And obviously, Martin, the sooner the better. Can I thank the witnesses very much for coming along this morning. Again, a very helpful session for our examination of the bill. I'm going to suspend the meeting very briefly while we clear the table before we move on to our next item. Okay, item 2 is our further consideration of petition 1395, which concerns funding for lesser taught languages at Scottish universities. We discussed the petition at our meeting on the 4th of June and agreed to write to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council. Members will have seen the responses we've received from both parties. We've also received letters from the University of Glasgow and, of course, the petitioner. Again, those were included in your papers. The committee must now consider what further action, if any, it wishes to take in relation to this petition, and I invite comments from members on public petition PE 1395. Anyone got any comments? Liz?
Convener, yes, I would like to make quite a number of comments on this. I've read this petition extremely carefully. I've also listened to debates within the Petitions Committee of this Parliament and also to the deliberations that were with the External Affairs, European Culture External Affairs Committee, who were considering the overall strategy of languages. Could I make 2 very specific points? The role of this committee, I don't see to be involved in the management of universities and their courses, because I think if we were to do that, we obviously open ourselves to this issue that may come in any of the faculties or different courses. And therefore, we're in danger of going down that road should we decide to pursue that. And I think we'd be in a difficult position, not least because of Glasgow University on that. Having said that, I think there is a very significant issue that is raised by this petition, which is about the generality of delivering languages through the education systems in this country, whether those are at school, colleges, universities. And I think, given that the government has a very specific programme of looking at the strategy and therefore about the funding of these, I think this petition raises a very important issue about how we do look after the best interests of language teaching, whether that's for majority languages or minority languages. And from that angle, I think we need to be much more proactive as a committee in questioning the Cabinet Secretary as to how we are pursuing that, and particularly with the Scottish Funding Council as to whether we are delivering the effective language teaching right across the education system. And so I would recommend, Convener, if we could pursue that line rather than on the specific issue, which I think, I'm sure there is an issue, but it's very difficult for us as a committee to get involved in that specific case.
I'll come back to the specifics of each individual member's views on a petition, but I'm asking for general comments on, so that's very helpful. Thanks, Liz. Neil.
Thanks, Convener. I think, as Liz Smith has said, this petition has raised important questions and issues around how we value lesser taught languages. It's obvious that if the Scottish Government wants to embark on an ambitious 2+1 model, that it needs to ensure languages are continue to be taught at Scottish universities. Otherwise, it could put that model at risk. The Cabinet Secretary, Mike Rossoni's response, I don't believe addresses this point, and I think there is a danger of a disconnect between a laudable national aim and what is happening on the ground. I believe we should write again to the Cabinet Secretary, Mike Russell, to express this view and to ask him to consider not just how languages like French, Spanish and Chinese fit into the government strategy, but also specifically lesser taught languages like Polish and Czech fit in, if they do at all. We have expressed our views on this matter, regardless of what we agree to do with the petition. If we agree to close it, it's now on the specific issue a matter for the Cabinet Secretary, the Funders Councils and the universities, but I would certainly agree with Liz Smith's suggestion that the committee needs to further scrutinise the overall aim and strategy of the government's approach to languages.
Thank you very much, Neil. Any other comments from members? Liam?
Just, I mean, I'd echo that. I mean, I'd have misgivings about entering into a situation where we appear to be micromanaging what happens in an individual university. However, if we aggregate that up, the danger is that we don't take an interest in any, and therefore the strategic objective in relation to languages, whether majority language or minority languages, isn't going to be delivered or achieved, and that would be a concern to the committee. But I think the only way we can prosecute that is really at the strategic level with the Cabinet Secretary and the Funding Council, and I think we can do that through the work of this committee, either writing directly and or taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary and Funding Council on that wider issue.
Anyone else wants to at this point? Claire?
Yeah, I agree with the generally with the idea that we close the petition, but follow up with a letter to the Cabinet Secretary. But I do think we should note that the Cabinet Secretary and both the Funding Council are pretty robust in their assessment that modern languages are diverse and the universities are providing a balanced view. But I don't see any problem in writing to gain further information.
Okay. If I could just make a comment then, I mean, I think, and I certainly agree with, I think, what seems to be a collective view about interfering with the individual ability of an organisation to manage its own affairs. And it opens us up, if we did do that, to, I think, accusations, quite rightly, that it's not our role to be involved in, micromanaging was the word, I think, Liam used, individual courses or individual decisions by the organisation, the university in this case. So I certainly agree with that. I do note, however, and I think we should write to the Cabinet Secretary. I think that's a reasonable suggestion. But I do note from the Funding Council's letter back to the committee that they talk about, towards the end of the letter, we have asked institutions to make specific reference to modern language provision in their outcome agreements for 2014-15 onwards. I think perhaps as a committee, though, and I want to separate these two things out, there's the petition, which has brought a very important issue to our attention, and then there's the ability of this committee to actually what we can do and where we can add value. And I think the issue for us might be to have a more detailed discussion on, as part of our work programme, about how we take forward this committee's examination of modern languages. Obviously taking note of the fact that another committee in the Parliament has already examined languages and will obviously not want to overlap or repeat what has already been done. But I think there is important work for this committee to do. I think we should discuss it in that particular context, and in particular in the context of outcome agreements. Given that that's been specifically mentioned by the Funding Council that modern languages have to be included in the outcome agreements, that gives us an opportunity to examine that closely. It was part of our work programme, and also we can certainly, as Claire, I think, and others mentioned, write to the Cabinet Secretary, and gives us future opportunity to seek the views of the Funding Council, given they mentioned it in their letter in terms of outcome agreements. Are members content, therefore, to close this specific petition, but bring this subject matter to back to the committee via the work programme, plus write to the Cabinet Secretary in the meantime? Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay, thank you very much for that discussion. Can I move on now to agenda item 3? Our third item is to appoint a new European Union reporter. Members will remember that Neil Findlay was our committee reporter. Neil Findlay has obviously resigned from the committee, and therefore we need to replace him, and therefore I invite nominations from members as to who they think would make a good European Union reporter for the Education Committee. Liam.
Claire.
Is Claire willing to be nominated?
Claire's happy to accept it.
Trying to keep out her line of sight here.
I'm sure she's delighted to accept that, given her role in the European Committee. Are there any other nominations? Any other members? Everybody looks at their shoes. Okay, well, if that's the case, can we therefore, does the committee therefore agree that Claire Adamson be appointed as our EU reporter? Yeah, it's agreed. It's agreed. Thank you very much. As our next item is in private, I close the meeting to the public.